All right, folks, I'm going to call this meeting to order at 3:04 p.m. But before we begin, we're going to start a territorial land acknowledgement. We respectfully acknowledge that the SFSS is located in the traditional, unceded territories of Coast Salish people, including the Musqueam, Squamish, Swallowtooth, Coquitlam, and Catsi nations. Unceded means that these territories have never been handed over, sold, or given up by these nations, and we are currently situated on unoccupied territories. All right, folks, I'm going to move on to the roll call of attendance. When I call on your position, please state your name, your pronouns, and your access needs. I will start with myself. Hello, everyone. Judith here. She, her pronouns, all my access needs are met. I will move on to the ex officio, who is not here. So I'm going to pass it to VP Finance.
Hi, everyone. My name is Abby. He, him pronouns, all my access needs are met.
Okay, thank you. I will go to Mathematics Counselor.
Hi everyone, my name is Ben, pronouns he, him, and all my access needs are met.
Awesome. Psychology Counselor.
Hi, my name is Mark. All my access needs are met. Yeah.
Thank you. Society of Arts and Social Sciences. Hillary in the chat. Hi y'all, I'm Hillary, she, her pronouns. My Wi-Fi is awful, so I'm currently suffering. and double fisting 2 meetings. Fingers crossed that the other one ends soon. So yeah. Thank you, Hillary. Noted. In terms of society staff, we don't have anyone here today. So we can move on to item number 4 on our agenda, which is the consent agenda, which reads, be it resolved to adopt the consent agenda by unanimous consent. In our consent agenda, we have 1.1 matters arising from the minutes, and it is our governance minutes from July 4th. So I'm going to seek unanimous consent on this. If you wish to dissent, please raise your hand or indicate in the chat. Seeing none, that carries unanimously. We are good to move on to item number 5, which is the adoption of the agenda, which reads, be it resolved to adopt the agenda as presented. Can I get a mover?
VP Finance.
VP Finance moves. Can I get a second?
Math.
Math seconds. If you have any amendments to the agenda, please drop them now in the chat. I will list myself first. So I have 2 amendments. So I'm going to move them as a batch, but I'm going to move to amend the agenda to add 2 new discussion items. One of them is item 10.4, which reads council refer Ccbc terms of reference, and item 10.5, which is communications policies. So I move that amendment. Can I get a second?
Math.
Math seconds. I'm going to open the floor for discussion on this amendment. Seeing none, I will move it to vote. Seeking unanimous consent, if you wish to dissent, please raise your hand or indicate in the chat. Seeing none, the amendment is carried. So now we move back to the main motion, which now reads, be it resolved to adopt the agenda as amended. Open it for discussion. Seeing none, take it to vote. Seeking unanimous consent, if you wish to dissent, please raise your hand or indicate in the chat. Seeing none, that carries unanimously. We can move on to new business. So we have a 17-page agenda. So let's get into it. Item number 9.1, council recommendation, housekeeping and procedural changes to R10. It is submitted by the mathematics counselor, which reads, be it resolved that governance committee recommends the following updates and changes to R10 of council policies, housekeeping and procedural changes to R10. Whereas there are several minor errors in R10 that requires correction as they result in the policy being unclear and potentially incorrectly applied by future councils. Whereas there are several procedural errors in R10 that are relatively minor in nature, which should be corrected to ensure that our procedures are consistent with policy. Be it resolved to amend R10.2 by striking the word committee in R10.2a. Be it further resolved to amend R10.3 by adding section C that reads, section C, list a record is the record of who votes in favor and against or abstains on a motion, or if a motion passes unanimously. Be it further resolved to amend R 10.5 by striking council designate and replacing it with designate. Be it further resolved to amend R 10.5A by adding the word "the" to the front of the policy. Be it further resolved to amend R 10.5B by striking "by the council" and replacing it with "by council." I will move. Can I get a second? Matt seconds. I will open the floor for discussion. Go ahead, Ben.
I can just briefly explain the changes here. So for the amendment to 10.2, it's just meeting minutes as to, for 10.2, it's for council meeting minutes, where it says it should include a summary of committee discussion and council meeting minutes, which doesn't make any sense. For 10.3, it's just adding the fact that for committee minutes, we do in fact record a list of people who voted every which way, because that's standard practice at all committees. For 10.5, we just replace it with designate, because council chair or council designate is redundant, and arguably the chair should be able to delegate that. 10.5A, it's just saying that it's the council chair, not council chair. And 10.5B is just adding a space for clarity reasons.
Okay, thank you. Any further discussion on this? Seeing that, I'm going to move this to vote. I will seek unanimous consent. If you should dissent, raise your hand or indicate in the chat. Seeing none, that carries unanimously. We will now move on to 9.2, council recommendation, housekeeping changes to R12. Submitted by mathematics counselor, which reads, be it resolved that governance committee recommends the following updates and changes to R12 of council policies. Housekeeping changes to R12, whereas R12 of council policies requires a minor fix to remove a typo, be it resolved to amend R12.2 by striking "or council." Can I get a mover?
Math
moves. Can I get a second?
VP Finance.
VP Finance seconds. I'll open the floor for discussion. Go ahead, Ben.
Just to explain what this change does, under 12.2, it currently says that a remuneration motion refers to any motion to create or amend any regulation which shall set or change the amount of a stipend or other remuneration paid to a member of council or council. So this is just changing it to say being paid to a member of council instead of a member of council or council.
Okay, cool. Any questions, comments? Okay, seeing none, I will move it to vote. I will seek unanimous consent. If you should dissent, please raise your hand or indicate in the chat. Seeing none, that carries unanimously. Okay, move on to item 9.3, recommendation to council, housekeeping changes to R15, submitted by mathematics counselor, which reads, be it resolved that governance committee recommends the following updates and changes to R15 of council policies, housekeeping changes to R15. Whereas there's a minor typo that should be corrected in R15 for clarity, whereas there's also an outdated line in R15 referencing benefits members of the board used to receive under an old version of the stipend structure, be it resolved to amend R15.3 by striking the word travel reimbursement does not count towards the $600 transportation allowance, be it further resolved to amend R15.3B by striking mail and replacing it with meal. Okay, I will move. Can I get a second?
Math.
Second, opening for discussion. Go ahead, then.
Do I need to amend the title on this? Or are we just considering the title to be changed?
We're just considering the title to be changed.
Okay, so then just to explain briefly what this does, that striking the words travel reimbursement does not count towards a $600 transportation allowance. Under an old stipend model, the board used to get a transportation allowance. Post April 2021, that's no longer true, so just removing that language. And in terms of the amendment to 15.3b, striking mail and replacing it with meal, it refers to meal reimbursements and not reimbursements towards any sort of postage.
Okay. Is there any other, Abby, you're on the list, go ahead.
Oh, Ben, question. Are we sure that it's not referring to mail reimbursement? Is there a separate section within the policy for mail reimbursement?
Yeah, go ahead then.
Given that the words before that were the word mail, and I quote, "Our meals require a detailed listing of the mail so that reasonableness may be considered," I believe it does in fact refer to meals in the sense of meals that one eats and not postage.
Are there any other comments, questions on the? Seeing none, I will move this to vote. So I will see unanimous consent. If you wish to dissent, please raise your hand or indicate in the chat. Seeing none, I carry unanimously. We can now move into item 9.4, recommendation to council, housekeeping changes to SO2. Again, submitted by mathematics counselor. It reads, be it resolved, the governance committee recommends the following updates and changes to SO2 of council policies. Housekeeping change to SO2. Whereas there are several minor typos that should be corrected in SO2 for clarity, whereas these typos should be corrected as they are still referencing the old governance model rather than the new governance model. Be it resolved to amend SO 2.3 by striking council committees and replacing it with council committees. Be it further resolved to amend SO 2.13 by striking in camera and replacing it with in dash camera. Be further resolved to amend SO 2.14A by striking each director and replacing it with each member of council. Be further resolved to amend SO 2.14B by striking director and replacing it with member of council. Can I get a mover?
Math.
Math moves. Can I get a second? Did we find seconds? Okay, we can find seconds. Open the floor for discussion. Go ahead, Ben.
Just to briefly explain this, the first two changes are just correcting typos. The other two changes we call directors members of council, so let's call them members of council everywhere.
Awesome. Any further discussion on this? Seeing none, I can move this to a vote, seeking unanimous consent. If you wish to dissent, raise your hand or indicate in the chat. Seeing none, that carries unanimously. We can move on to item 9.5, recommendation to council, procedural and housekeeping changes to SO3, submitted by mathematics counselor. It reads, be it resolved that governance committee recommends the following updates and change to SO3 of council policies, procedural and housekeeping change to SO3. Whereas there are procedural issues in SO3 that do not reflect established practices, in that the executive committee has not met weekly since the new governance model change. Whereas there are minor housekeeping issues also need to be addressed within SO3 to ensure that SO3 can be clearly interpreted by council. Be it further resolved to amend SO 3.2 by striking in the and replacing it in the. Be further resolved to amend SO 3.3 by striking in between and replacing it with in between. Be further resolved to amend SO 3.5 by striking specific portfolio and replacing it with specific portfolios. Be further resolved to strike SO 3.10, replace it with 3.10. The committee shall meet in person or electronically at the call of the chair. The chair may call a meeting where a notice of 2 working days has been provided. I will move. Can I get a second?
Ben.
Ben, second. Open the floor for discussion. Go ahead, Ben.
Yeah, I just want to actually amend this based on something someone just caught. I'd like to amend the recommendation to council to include another be it resolved clause that reads, Be it further resolved to amend the composition by adding in a new 0.5 that reads as follows and renumbering accordingly.
Under composition, I presume.
Under composition, yes, a new 0.5. It would read, so I basically just want to add a be it resolved clause to the recommendation that reads like this. I can just type it in the chat.
It'd be really nice to have some elevator music right about now.
I just want to amend to add that to the recommendation.
Okay. Okay, so Ben is gonna move to amend to include another be it resolved clause that reads be it further resolved to amend the composition section of SO3 by adding in a new 0.5 that reads non-voting building manager and renumber accordingly. I will second that amendment. Open the floor for discussion on this. Seeing none, I will take it to a vote. I will seek unanimous consent. If you wish to dissent, please raise your hand or indicate in chat. Seeing none, that is carried unanimously. So we are now back to the main motion. And given that it's not that long, I feel the requirement to read the whole thing again. So, be it resolved that Governance Committee recommends the following updates and changes to SO3 of Council Policy, procedural and housekeeping change to SO3, whereas there are procedural issues in SO3 that do not reflect established practices in the executive committee that has not met weekly since the new governance model change, whereas there are minor housekeeping issues that also need to be addressed within SO3 to ensure that SO3 can clearly be interpreted by Council. Be it further resolved to amend SO 3.2 by striking in the and replacing it in the. Be it further resolved to amend SO 3.2 by striking in between and replacing it in between. Be it further resolved to amend SO 3.5 by striking specific portfolios and replacing the specific portfolios. Be it further resolved to strike SO 3.10 and replace it with 3.10. The committee shall meet in person, electronically, or at the call of the chair. The chair may call a meeting where notice of 2 working days. Be it further resolved to amend the composition section of SO3 by adding in a new 0.5 that reads non-voting building manager and renumber accordingly. Open up for discussion on this. Go ahead, Ben.
Just briefly explain these changes. So the first 3 changes are just adding in spaces to places where they're needed. 3.10 after that is just removing the requirement that exec meet weekly because exec doesn't meet weekly. They have traditionally always met bi-weekly. And adding in the building manager to composition, it's just to have all union excluded staff as non-voting members, seeing as the other 2 union excluded managers are already non-voting members. And I actually will offer one other amendment, is just to strike the word further in the first be it further resolve clause of the recommendation.
That's kind of my fault. We shouldn't have hesitated on that one. Okay, he moves that amendment. I will second. Open the floor for discussion. Seeing none, take it to a vote. Seeing unanimous consent, wish to dissent, raise your hand or anything in chat. Seeing none, that carries. We are now again back to the main portion. I will not read this again. I refuse. It's the same thing. It's just further is gone from the previous resolved clause. Okay. Open up for discussion on this again. Seeing none. I will take this to a vote. I will seek unanimous consent if you wish to dissent. Raise your hand or indicate in chat. Seeing none, that carries as amended. We can now move on to 9.6. Governance Subcommittee SO 5.1. Submitted by myself. It reads, whereas Governance Committee under Section 5.6 outlines the power of the committee to strike subcommittees, whereas Governance Committee may delegate power to subcommittees, whereas under Section 5.3 of Governance Committee's terms of reference outlines powers to review appeals or questions regarding the interpretation and application of society's constitution, bylaws, and policies, except those specifically reserved to other committees of the society. Be it resolved to delegate the power of presiding a governance committee under Section 5.3 to strike the subcommittee SO 5.1 Governance Appeals Committee. Be it further resolved that Governance Committee approves and adopts SO 5.1 as attached in document SO 5.1. I'm going to move, then I got a second.
Math.
Matt seconds. I will open up the floor for discussion on this. I will go first. So we have gotten to the position where a lot of things are coming to governance committee, and a lot of them are in relation to our bylaws and policies being so, for lack of words, lax, that it is unclear as to how they're applicable and what the actual jurisdiction over our policies are. And it is becoming blatantly obvious that this committee has enough on its plate as is, catching up on all these policy reviews and amendments that stacked up over the past year and a half. So at this point, I do want to move some of these more contentious issues to a subcommittee that can deal with it on a basis as to it requires to be. It would require governance committee to pass it on to them, basically, so they can unilaterally take things, but it might be just more efficient for us to deal with that at a different committee and have that committee just focus on that specifically versus us being here and dealing with it most likely in camera, which is not exactly the best delegation of our time or resources. So yeah, I think that's the main point of it. We can deal with those issues over there instead here. But yeah. Does anybody have any questions? Oh no. Yes, Ben, you're on the list.
I just wanted to say I was glad to see that certain changes were made to the TOR before this was brought to governance.
For context of those who are watching this, a certain member of governance committee kind of clipped my wings on that governance subcommittee's terms of reference. So now it's purely operating within the frameworks it's supposed to, and it is reviewing any inconsistencies or any disputes that we may have in terms of society documentation. You're next on the list, Abby, go ahead.
I have to say, I think the absolute opposite of Ben. I would have liked to see the original TOR come as is, so I'm a little disappointed to see it changed. I'll still vote in favor of it, but I am disappointed.
Well, since I'm next on the list, I can say as much as unless we make substantial changes to governance committee's original terms of reference, can't really have, unfortunately, the original copy. However, I have saved a backup copy for my personal viewing because it was beautiful. I don't think at this point, quite frankly, council would go for such amendments to SO5 at this point in time, maybe down the line, but not now. It would make us, quite frankly, too powerful. So, any other discussion on this item? If there isn't any, I can move us to a vote on. I can move us to a vote on this. I'm so glad people can't see the chat. I'm gonna move this to a vote. I will seek unanimous consent. If you wish to dissent, please raise your hand or indicate in chat. Seeing none, that carries unanimously. We can now move on to 9.7, recommendation to council housekeeping changes to MGP1, submitted mathematics counselor. It reads, be it resolved that governance committee recommends the following updates and changes to MGP1 of member certain and group policies, housekeeping change to MGP1. Whereas there is a minor error in MGP1, be it resolved to amend MGP 1.3 subsection A by striking SFU SFSS members and replacing it with SFSS members and fix the indenting throughout the policy. Can I get a mover?
Math.
Math moves, can I get a second?
EP Finance.
EP Finance, seconds. Open floor for discussion. Go ahead, Ben.
Just to explain this, we call our membership SFSS members, not SFU SFSS members, and also we need to fix the god-awful indenting in this policy.
Seeing that I'm gonna place myself in the list, I think the reason that it originally said SFU or SFSS members is to maybe restrict membership to only SFU undergrads, because we do have associate members under our bylaws who may not be SFU students, but still could be SFSS members if they pay their society fees. That be the reason? Yes, Ben?
It's not clear to me that that would be the reason. Seeing as we also do include fixed students, I'm unsure as to whether the intent there was to solely limit it to, like, we call them registered members, I think, not associate members.
Okay. All right. Well, anybody have questions, thoughts, comments on this? Okay. Seeing that there is an exhaustive speakers list, I will move this to a vote. I will seek unanimous consent. If you wish to dissent, raise your hand or indicate in the chat. Seeing none, that carries unanimously. We can move on to 9.8, recommendation to council procedural and housekeeping changes to MGP4. Submitted mathematics counselor, which reads, be it resolved that governance committee recommends the following updates and changes to MGP4 of members, service and group policies. Procedural and housekeeping changes to MGP4, whereas there are several minor spelling errors in MGP4. Whereas there is also a procedural ambiguity that exists in MGP 4.225 regarding the procedure for suspension of student unions, be it resolved to amend MGP 4.21 by striking the council and replacing it with council. Be it further resolved to amend MGP 4.23 by striking the council and replacing it with council. Be it further resolved to amend MGP 4.25 by striking the council and replacing it with council. Be it resolved to amend MGP 4.25 by adding a new section A that reads, council may do so by a motion requiring a 2/3 majority vote of members in attendance at the council meeting. Such a motion shall require 3-week notice to council. Be it further resolved to amend MGP 4.26 subsection D by striking VP finance and replacing it with VP finance and services. I will move. Can I just
Math.
VP finance seconds. Open the floor for discussion. Go ahead, Ben.
Just to briefly explain these changes here, for the amendments to 4.21, 4.23, and 4.25, at least the initial amendment, we refer to council throughout society regulation as council and not as the council. In terms of the amendment, adding a new section A to 4.25, that's to try and suggest a procedure here by which the suspension of student unions could be done, because currently it's somewhat ambiguous as to what the procedure might be. I'm just suggesting to governance here that the procedure be the same as it is to establish a council seat for a student union, which is a 2/3 majority vote with 3 weeks notice per bylaw. And the amendment to 4.26D is just to reflect the new governance model that the VP Finance is now known as Finance and Services.
Okay. Any questions? Seeing none, I will move this to a vote. I will seek unanimous consent. If you would consent, raise your hand or indicate in the chat. Seeing none, that carries unanimously. We can move on to item 9.9, recommendation to council, housekeeping changes to IEC 1, submitted by the mathematics counselor. It reads, be it resolved that governance committee recommends the following updates and changes to IEC 1 of election and referendum policies. IEC 1 housekeeping changes, whereas IEC 1 subsection 13 currently makes reference to executive board members, whereas the SFSS now refers to those members of executive officers. Be it resolved to amend IEC 1 subsection 13 by striking IEC 1 subsection 13A and replacing it with the chief commissioner shall receive a stipend equivalent to that of an executive officer. Be further resolved to amend IEC 1 subsection 13 by striking IEC 1 subsection 13 subsection B and replacing it with electoral commissioner shall receive a stipend equivalent to that of half an executive officer. Can I get a mover? Math moves. Is there a second?
VP Finance.
VP Finance. I will open the floor for discussion. Yes, Ben?
Basically, the only thing I'm changing here is just to change, currently chief commissioners get stipend equivalent to that of an executive board member. Electoral commissioners get a stipend equivalent to half of an executive board member. I'm just changing it so that we say that they get those same stipends, but referencing the stipend received by an executive officer, not an executive board member.
Okay. Any questions, thoughts? Seeing none, I will move it to a vote. I will seek unanimous consent. If you wish to dissent, please raise your hand or indicate in the chat. Seeing none, that carries unanimously. We move on to now 9.10, recommendation to council P1 housekeeping fixes. It is submitted by myself. It reads, be it resolved, the governance committee formally recommends to council the following changes to the privacy and information management policies. Privacy and information management policies housekeeping fixes, whereas there are numerous formatting issues in P1, whereas these formatting issues should be fixed to standardize them with the rest of the privacy and information management policies. Be it resolved that council approves the following changes to P1 as attached in P1 fixes. I will move. Can I get a second?
Math.
VP Finance.
Matt seconds. I will open the floor for discussion. So just to give some clarity, what's happening here is we have a lot of like situations where somebody just even press enter and a section is in the wrong line and it looks weird and the formatting is quite frankly very much so off. We have also issues in terms of referencing people's roles and it's the wrong roles. The reason it's not written out point blank is it would take forever. So we are basically suggesting that council that here's a fixed copy, adopt it. That's basically what's happening because the formatting is so way off that this would require me to write like a 1.5 page motion. And I'm not sure if it would be more clear than just attaching a document. So yeah. Any questions? Seeing none, I will move it to a vote. I will seek unanimous consent. If you wish to dissent, raise your hand or indicate in the chat. Seeing none, that carries unanimously. We will move on to now section 9.11, recommendation to council P3 housekeeping fixes submitted by mathematics counselor. It reads, be it resolved that governance committee recommends the following updates and changes to P3 of privacy information management policies. P3 housekeeping fixes. Whereas there are several minor housekeeping and numbering changes required in P3, whereas these minor issues should be fixed to ensure clarity within P3. Be it resolved that council approves the changes to P3 outlined in the attached document. P3 fixes. Can I get a mover?
Math.
Math moves. Can I get a second?
AP Finance.
AP Finance seconds. I will open the floor for discussion. Go ahead then.
So same thing with as with Judith's thing with the P1 fixes. There are so many minor issues here that writing them all out in a motion would take forever. So the big thing is that the numbering is all wrong. We have 2 section 1s, 2 section 2s, 2 section 3s, and 2 section 4s. So just renumbering to fix all of that. And also there's just some places where people seem to have randomly hit the enter or delete key. So also just fixing that, and in one location striking the council and replacing it with council.
Okay. Any questions, thoughts, comments? Seeing none, I will move this to a vote. I will seek unanimous consent. If you wish to dissent, raise your hand or indicate in chat. Seeing none, that carries unanimously. We will now move on to item 9.12, recommendation to council P4 housekeeping fixes submitted by mathematics counselor. Be it resolved that, which reads, be it resolved the governance committee recommends the following updates and changes to P4 of privacy information management policies. P4 housekeeping fixes, whereas there are several minor housekeeping and numbering changes required in P4. Whereas these minor issues should be fixed to ensure clarity within P4. Be it resolved that council approves the changes to P4 outlined in the attached document. P4 fixes. I will move. Can I get a second?
Math.
Math seconds. I will open the floor for discussion. Yes, fine. Go ahead.
So just to explain these changes, same as with P3, there are a bunch of minor errors that take too long, frankly, to write into a motion. So to cover them, there's 2 section 1s and 2 section 2s. So just renumbering the entire policy to fix that. There's also in P44A, there's a section B that's sort of within A. So just making sure someone hits the enter key there. And striking the council and replacing it with council again.
There seems to be a theme here. Okay. Any other questions, thoughts? Seeing none, I will take it to vote. Seeking unanimous consent. If you wish to dissent, raise your hand or indicate in chat. Seeing none, that carries unanimously. We can now move on to item 9.13, recommendation to council P5 housekeeping fixes submitted by mathematics counselor, which reads, be it resolved that governance committee recommends the following updates and change to P5 of privacy and information management policy. P5 housekeeping fixes. Whereas there are several minor housekeeping changes required in P5, whereas these minor issues should be fixed to ensure clarity within P5, be it resolved to amend P5 subsection 4 by striking the word report concerns and replace it with report their concerns. Be it further resolved to amend P5 subsection 5 by striking the word person and replacing it with personal. Oh, that's it. Can I get a mover?
Math.
Math moves. I will second. I will open the floor for discussion. Go ahead, Ben.
So for the first change, it's just literally changing where it says that members who have personal info in the custody of the society may report concerns to the OIPC. It's just saying that they may report their concerns to the OIPC. P55, it's just to say that efforts will be made to recover any confidential or personal information. Currently, it says efforts will be made to recover any confidential or person information. And also, as you can tell, I'm really creative with my whereas clauses on recommendations.
Well, I wasn't going to say it, but okay. Any more comments, questions? Seeing none, I'll move this to a vote. Seeking unanimous consent. If you wish to dissent, please raise your hand or indicate in the chat. Seeing none, that carries unanimously. We can move on to item 9.14, recommendation to council. Composure who? Item 9.14, recommendation to council, empty page removal in privacy and information management policies. Submitted by mathematics counselor. It reads, be it resolved that governance committee recommends the following updates and changes to privacy and information management policies. Empty page removal in privacy information management policy. Whereas there are several empty pages in information privacy management policy that contain no policy language within them, whereas these pages should be removed to ensure that the policy is the appropriate length. Be it resolved to amend privacy and information management policy by removing all empty pages. I will move this. Can I get a second?
I will second.
Ben will second. I will open the floor for discussion on this. Go ahead, Ben.
I want to explain what this is really the most serious nom of the day. We're removing 2 empty pages.
Seeing that I'm next on the list, I'd like to highlight that our policy procedures are so strict here at the SFSS that we can't even remove an empty page from policy without doing a 2-week notice to the membership. I see that the direct response to me. Go ahead, Ben.
These are extremely serious matters. What if removing an empty page has untold knock-on effects?
Abby, you're next on the list.
I'm just going to add on to what Ben said there. I'm just going to ask, is this going to affect the feng shui of the document at all? Are we sure we want to do this?
I just want to ask VP Finance by what he means by feng shui of the document. Go ahead, VP Finance.
So if the blank pages are gone, is it still going to look balanced? Is it still going to like maybe people need a little break after looking at all that text? The blank page is kind of that refresher for the eyes. So I just want to make sure that we want to keep with those access needs in mind, you know. So yeah.
Yes, Ben, you're next on the speakers list.
I think that having policies be the appropriate length and no longer than they need to be is extremely important, and we should truly recommend this very important notice of motion to council. I cannot underscore how important this notice truly is.
Seeing that I'm next on the list, I also want to highlight that it is way more accessible to ensure that the policy is the appropriate length, given the fact that some folks may not want to read a document that said it's like 40 pages long, but in reality, it's only like what, 30 something of it is actually policy, for example. The rest are just empty pages. And furthermore, it is also quite problematic because if a member looks at our policy and sees an empty page, it might look like there's policy missing, when in reality, it's just an empty page for who knows what reason. Oh, just for clarity in the chat, privacy and information management policies is only 16 pages long, but my example still stands. Any other questions, comments on the empty page removal? Seeing none, I will move this to a vote. I will seek unanimous consent. Unless folks think I should do a roll call vote on this. So I will seek unanimous consent. If you wish to dissent, please raise your hand or indicate in chat. Is that a dissent, mathematics counselor?
I want my abstention on the matter noted.
Okay. Yes, VP Finance?
Me too, please.
Okay, abstention for Math and VP Finance. But seeing no dissent, this still carries. Thank you for the fantastic motion, mathematics counselor. We can move on to now item 9.15, recommendation to council, changes to OTP2, submitted by myself. It reads, be it resolved that governance committee formally recommends the following changes to orientation retention OTP2, logistical updates to OTP2, new council orientation. Whereas substantive changes are required to the current orientation retention policies, new council orientation OTP2, whereas council orientation should be distinguished from executive orientation policy given their nature, whereas there are numerous grammar, formatting, and numbering errors as well. Be it resolved that council approves and adopts the changes to OTP2 as attached. I will move. Can I get a second?
VP Finance.
VP Finance seconds. I will open the floor for discussion on this. And given that I made this motion, I'm going to go first. So a couple things. Currently, in the current policies, first off, if you're watching, the one on the website is a lie. That's not the current orientation retention policies. I don't know why the current ones are not on the website, but point being, currently we have both executive and council orientation one policy, which is quite frankly reckless, given the fact that executive officers simply have more duties to adhere to than a non-executive counselor would. Not to mention that executive counselors deal with HR, their signing authority, all these things that non-executive counselors simply do not deal with. So to slide in executive orientation into the policy in a small section with like what 3 bullet points is quite frankly inadequate and borderline reckless. So I suggest that we move that policy into a different policy and let council orientation be its own thing, given the fact that council now is made up of 50 members. So speaking as myself organized one, it is a process to organize something that works with 50 people in the first place, and overseeing like catering, days of sessions, speakers, all these things, tech. It's a whole nother beast in itself. So I don't think it's appropriate to slide into one policy and hope for the best. And quite frankly, I think this is something that stayed behind from the old governance model where the board was only like 17 people. So it was easier to organize and deal with. So given that's no longer the case, I think it's time that our policies in training reflect that. But I will pass the speakers list to Ben. Go ahead, Ben.
I was just going to say, yeah, I fully agree that these two should be separated into new council and new executive orientation. And I'm very happy to see my suggestion of Robert's Rules of Order included in the orientation language of OTP2.
Yeah, for sure. So it's especially important for executives who have not chaired or have not been part of student unions prior to their executive roles, unless you enjoy reading Robert's Rules for fun in your spare time, which I don't see how you would if you have not been part of student unions prior, but we would not know how to chair or how Robert's Rules works. And given that majority of society operates on that, it could be quite daunting to walk in and have no idea what's going on, or have a very, very minuscule understanding based on council orientation, because there's only so much you can cover at council orientation. So yeah, that should be a key area of focus. All right, anybody else? If there's no further discussion on this or questions to me, I will move this to a vote. I will seek unanimous consent. If you wish to dissent, raise your hand or indicate in chat. Seeing none, that carries unanimously. We will now move on to item 9.16, recommendation to council adoption of OTP3, incoming executive officers, submitted by myself, which reads, be it resolved that the governance committee formally recommends to council to adopt the following changes to orientation policies, OTP, adoption of OTP3, incoming executive officers. whereas the current orientation retention policies are outdated, whereas the current orientation retention policies are insufficient in preparing incoming executive officers for their roles, whereas further and more rigorous training is required for incoming executives to ensure that society continues to operate optimally during the transitional periods. Be it resolved that Council adopts the proposed additions of OTP3 incoming executive officers are attached. Be it further resolved, the Council approves the renumbering of orientation retention policies from OTP3 onwards. I will move. Can I get a second?
Math.
Now, seconds, I will open the speakers list. And given that I'm the person on the speakers list, so I may or may not have sat down on Sunday and rewrote the entire section from OTP2 that we basically took out, and now is the hopefully new version of OTP3, which basically outlines the curriculum for executive officers, ranging from Robert's Rules training to HR training, building operations, finance, and these aspects that are quite frankly the basics of what an executive officer does on a daily basis, and quite frankly the things that should be covered more in depth. These sessions have to be hours long, not just like 10 minutes or 15 minutes or 20 minutes, to actually understand how the department works and how the programs works that department heads use. It just really helps executive officers understand what their staff does daily, and for that to be a reasonable relationship between staff and executive officers, where execs aren't demanding staff to produce X results when it's just simply not feasible. It also just helps oriented execs as to who to go to when something is wrong. And in general, just avoiding last minute nightmarish transitions, ensuring that signing authority and all of that is transferred in time, making sure that the next VP of Finance is in a position where it can actually have access to the bank account information that's necessary. It's ensuring that executives are actually getting trained as to how to fill out their work reports properly, so that training work reports reflects what the current work reports will look like for executive officers, and getting them the habit of submitting one bi-weekly. The situation where they get paid 30 hours is still in effect, but we did clarify if an executive officer is working over, an incoming executive officer is working more than 30 hours, that is voluntary basis. So in essence, we also added in a disciplinary procedure into the policy, because that is something that was missing. And quite frankly, if you're an incoming exec under the current policy, it is quite frankly unclear as to who is the boss of you. Oversight committee on officers isn't, they don't have purview over you, unless you're a sitting exec, in which case, sucks to be you. Other committees, not really. The president, questionable. I think the only committee that can truly get you is probably Ccbc, but that's a whole other issue in itself. So this is just establishing that the current outgoing exec has the ability to issue a formal warning if necessary, and that can be escalated to the outgoing president if necessary, and if it's really an issue, has to be escalated to council. So there are those safeguards where incoming execs are just not wreaking havoc. But I think I spoke long enough, so I'm going to return to the speakers list, and I think the next person on the speakers list is Ben.
Yeah, so my question here is, will this policy have to go through the R12 procedure, as we are setting new regulation that does change the stipend available to certain members of council?
No. No, the 30-hour requirement was already in there in the old policy. That's not changing. Yes, go ahead.
Not referring to the 30-hour requirement, I mean the $200 per period stipend reduction that we are implementing when incoming executives do not complete their training sessions by May 1st.
Given that, I would say no. Given the fact that when council policies were adopted and made these changes in the last outgoing board, the only process that went through R12 was the living wage model. If maybe finance wants to correct me on this, it's free to do so. But to the best of my understanding, the reductions were not part of the R12 procedures. Okay. Yes, go ahead then.
Sorry, but those reductions weren't adopted when OTP was adopted on April 23rd. What?
Pretty much all of council policies was adopted on April 23rd because they basically pulled all the policies and replaced them. Okay, I think the next person on the list was Abby. Yes, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I think there's a huge need for this. It's really important that certain executives are training all their staff, you know, like we can't have people with just 15 minutes of training or something like that, right? Or people just not training their predecessors because they don't like them. That's just something that can't happen. It's extremely unprofessional. I think it's really important that we have this policy in place and we have the appropriate punishments in place as well in the forms of stipend reduction to ensure incoming execs are doing the work that's required of them as well. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. And given the fact I'm next on the list, it's also there's also a provision in it that incoming execs do need to like present and publish their annual plan by the third week of May, I believe, which is super useful for membership because currently there's not really anywhere that we need to publish our annual plans, which I think is not the best. And given the fact that they have until the third week of May, that kind of gives them time to also figure out their position. But if they're working close with their outgoing exec, they should already know what their position entails and how it operates. Honestly, the main point of this policy is to ensure that outgoing execs have this kind of like almost hand-holding mentality towards incoming execs. Like show them how you do your things. For example, for me, it would be super useful for someone to tell me how to go through submitting a notice of motion. Like who do I send it to? What's the process of it? Rather than figuring it out myself on my first week of the job, which isn't great. So just giving executives a hands-on training to actually see what their role is like and how it operates, the main staff you'll be working with, the expectations and stuff, and just making sure that your annual plan is like within the scope of your portfolio instead of promising something you absolutely cannot do in 1 year's time or at all. Next person on the list is Ben. Go ahead.
I want to say that I agree with what the VP Finance had said. It's having a more structured policy in this case does seem useful to prevent potential occurrences of politically motivated lack of training.
Okay. Does anybody have any further comments? Thoughts? Okay. If not, I will end the speakers list here and I will move this to a vote. I will seek unanimous consent. If you wish to dissent, please raise your hand or in the chat. Seeing none, that carries unanimously. Cool. We can move on to section 10, which is our discussion items. 10.1 is policy review check-in, submitted by myself. So at this point, folks know the drill as to what we're doing here. I wanted to check in with everyone to see how we're doing and whether we're still on track. To the best of my understanding, we are. So what was supposed to be reviewed by today was the policy manual and the retail and services policies. I can go ahead and just tell you right now, I don't know where like 4/5 of our retail policies are. Like, no one knows. They're gone. Yes, Ben?
So I do happen to know where 4/5 of our retail services policies went. Um, in the old governance model, there was a initial restructuring that was done in around June or July of 2020, where there was a big batch of amendments passed, including a proper version of retail services policies, unlike the version that we did see passed on April 23rd, 2021. My recommendation would be we just use those and rewrite them to be based on current staff names and positions, rather than following the procedure currently outlined in the policy assignment stock with regards to RSP.
Okay. But if they were repealed, are they even applicable to how society works at this point, or? Go ahead.
Based on what I can see, the thing is they weren't repealed. They were repealed and replaced with retail services policies. However, the new retail services policies are wrong and are fake, sort of. And the real retail services policies, if they're still applicable, the ones from June of 2020 seem similar enough to the ones from April of 2021 to provide us a good place to start. And so I would just base it on that, and then we can just start drafting amendments to, like, there are obviously issues with position names of various staff members and just other basic issues. It doesn't follow our policy template and so on.
Okay. All right, thank you. Other than that, the other thing was the policy manual. So, I suggested a couple edits to the policy manual to ensure that we no longer have to pass notice of motions to remove an empty page, basically. So I think the most noteworthy fix would be addition of 1.8, which reads, minor fixes that do not impact the intent or meaning of the policy may be updated by Policy Research and Community Affairs, PRCA, without process outlined in section 1.2 and 1.3. These fixes are limited to spelling mistakes, formatting fixes, updating adoption dates when incorrect, renumbering when necessary, and subsection 1, notwithstanding sections 1.8. C through D, the PRC is required to submit a brief written report to council at the next available council meeting, reporting set changes. So, quite frankly, this could make our lives very much easier, no longer passing motions to adding an extra space between words, no more passing motions to clarify from meal to mail to whatever, and no more notices to remove an empty page, because they would fall under formatting, no empty page, and no more motions basically make PRC press enter. So it would make our lives a lot easier, and it would maybe help council not be so mad at us when we pass like 20 notice of motions. But Ben, you're next to the speakers, let's go ahead.
Yeah, so the one thing that I would, or two things that I would change about 1.8 would be to also, under your proposed 1.8C, change that to also give the PRCA the power to update adoption and revision dates. And under 1.8D1, just say that the PRCA is required to submit a brief written report at the next council meeting rather than the next available council meeting.
Okay.
Because the reasoning for 1.8C is that we do have a ton of revision dates and adoption dates that are all completely incorrect.
We love to see it. Okay. And then the other changes are just quite frankly to make things more clear. Under section 1.3 ENF, it talks about like the vote threshold required to adopt policies that are rules, and the other section about policies that are standing orders, administrative policies, issues policies, and any other policy society that only require a simple majority. It's just clarifying that if you want to reappeal a policy that requires a 2/3 threshold, you need a 2/3 threshold to reappeal it. And if you are trying to reappeal a policy that requires simple majority, then it's a simple majority to reappeal it, which should be common sense. But sometimes it's better just to spell it out, I think. Yes, Ben, you're on the list.
Can also say that I do largely agree with these changes, especially the clarification to PM 1.2 D2 with regards to how policy should be circulated to council. Previously, it's just been established as past practice and I guess precedent at this point that circulated to email list means sent on agenda because, well, the agenda is circulated to the council mailing list. But yeah, clarifying that, clarifying how policies are repealed is good. And I'd just be curious as to how those rules interact with policies adopted at members' meetings.
Unless I'm incorrect, if policies go up to the members' meetings, that's still a policy. I don't think you will require a members' meeting to get rid of it. So it would still apply under the policy manual. It would be quite unfortunate. But
That's just clarification I'd be interested on as to whether we would require a members meeting to repeal a policy enacted by a members meeting, because I know members meetings can now enact issues policies at least.
yeah, I think pushing policy at members meeting may not be the most prudent thing to do, especially if some policies require a 2/3 threshold. I think policies maybe should just reserve it to council because AGMs already have a lot of bylaw amendments and other endeavors on there that may take up space and are more appropriate for AGMs and policy amendments. But I expect, which is in hindsight quite unfortunate, that like council could probably reappeal that policy if passed at an AGM. It would be politically horrible, but I think our policies allow for it because the policy. Curious about interaction with 6.0 because council shall be bound by any resolution made by membership via membership meeting. We haven't passed policy at an AGM before, have we now? This probably will not be the best time to start. Go ahead, Ben.
Yeah, I guess just to clarify what I'm thinking about here is if say membership wants to pass some issues policy at a members meeting, and because council is bound by the membership in terms of resolutions made at members meetings via the membership, does that bind council to the policy and make it only repealable by the membership? That's just sort of what I'm thinking about. I'm not sure.
I think I don't think we should pass policies at membership meetings. I think it's easily a fixable situation, just don't pass policy membership meetings. But to answer your question, I don't know. And I think it's an unfortunate situation where our bylaws are not super clear as to it, because it is assumed that if you are calling for a members meeting, it's only for select reasons, and policy amendment is not one of them. So I don't know if we particularly apply to things that aren't requiring a members meeting. This is a good question for a lawyer. Go ahead then.
I mean, I fully agree with you. It is probably not a very smart idea to pass policy at a members meeting. But yeah, I think we might want to check with legal as to what would happen there if that were to happen, though I can't seriously imagine anyone trying that, because it does seem easier to just do it at council. Unless it's maybe to, I guess, show support exists for the policy, but even then, why do it as policy and not a bylaw amendment? But I think we should get legal, maybe, to clarify.
Sorry. Go ahead, Abby.
I was going to concur with Ben, and I said a reason to do it at an AGM might be that the student body has a different opinion than, say, council as a whole. For example, council as a whole may be very, very against a certain IP, but the student body may be very in favor of it. That would be a reason to do it at a members meeting rather than at council, because it's just simply not possible to do it at council.
Go ahead then.
Yeah, I guess I would concur with the VP Financer on this, but seeing as largely AGM items would be brought by council, there's that to consider. But I guess if we're looking at an IP that's been brought by membership petition, I think that's sort of where that comes in. I arguably think we should just get some more clarity on it. Not trying to hold up any amendments to the PM here.
It's the list. Yeah, I quite frankly I see it happening. It is a good question, and I think that's something you could pass on to legal, and if it's relevant, you can go back to it. But my understanding would be, since it's still only a policy, policies can be amended, reappealed by council, and I don't necessarily think you need a membership meeting for it. If that be the case, that'd be a very for lack of better words, a snaky move to do, especially if you want something cemented into policy until like the next AGM. But I don't think it would change the requirements, because it's, again, only policy. Okay. Any other discussion on the policy manual changes? I also want to clarify that the reason that we are volunteering the policy research coordinator is mostly because they're a staff member. They're more likely to stick around and are in a position where it's harder to make an argument that they'd be politically biased versus if we would give this power to the VP internal, who's elected in for only a year. I think that kind of just offers more continuity, and just in general, it is a safer bet when it comes to fixing even minor things. So I think that's probably the best way of going about it. And again, it's only just formatting and spelling fixes and just little things. Like if we wanted to change VP Finance, VP Finance and Services, it would still be required to a notice. So we are not giving too much power away. We are just letting our staff fix typos, which I think is a fair request from council. And given the fact that we just dropped 21 notices in their last council meeting, I think they might agree. Go ahead, Abby.
I was also going to say it makes sense to trust our staff, because our staff are the people who continue on after a year. Each exec stays for 1, maybe 2 years if they're really, really into it. So to have someone who's been here for many, many years fixing the policies and giving them this level of power, I think is totally appropriate.
Yeah, I concur. Yes, go ahead then.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's appropriate to give that power to staff, and yeah, maybe reading out 21 notices at a council meeting is something we don't want to repeat.
Didn't think you'd read it out. Not all 21 of them. Okay. If we don't, so governance committee appreciates the transparency of the council vice chair for reading out all of the amendments, though I would maybe suggest, if you're reading them out, maybe just read the title, not the entire motion, given that some of them are like a page long. Just a thought. Okay. So given the fact that if we track down retail sources policies, we will be also moving on to finance policies and communications policies at our next check-in, which is great. We are so far on schedule, which is great to see. I didn't think we would last this long, to be frank. So I do want to flag that those two policies will require us definitely to go to our staff to make sure whatever changes we're making to them are okay and on board with them. I did the same for orientation retention and our corporate policies today to make sure they know what's going on, because we're not just offering typo fixes, we are offering some substantial fixes. So we will move on to those. So we can move on to the next item, which is 10.2 bylaw review. I want to check in with folks to see how that's going, and mostly because we were kind of drowning in other things. So I wanted to check in to see if anybody has anything glaring they want to raise, because there are glaring things to raise, and quite frankly, I can go on hours about bylaw 13, but yeah, my only recommendation for bylaw 13 would be to just simplify, clarify, and move to policy, which I think is a reasonable request, given that that bylaw is pages long and single-spaced pages long. But anybody has anything they want to add into this? Go ahead, Ben.
I just have been looking at the various bylaws I've been working on, and some things that I do think we could add is just some clarity generally to certain bylaws to prevent any potential future abuse by virtue of certain definitions being very broad or vague.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's, yeah, because I'm looking at bylaw 1 as well. I know the definitions are very loose and unclear, and I am quite frankly surprised that that hasn't caused us problems yet. Well, it kind of has, but that's a April 27th problem. So yes, go ahead then.
So the other thing I was going to say is, one thing I do want to change is clarity in what the quorum requirement is for a faculty student union to establish a levy, because that is somewhat unclear in our current bylaws. That's to do with like bylaw 16 would be where I'd put it, probably.
Sure. Especially if we're moving to the more decentralized SFSS, I think it's really valuable to have like clear procedure on it and not have absolute mayhem. So good point. Anybody else? Okay, cool. If there aren't any other discussion on this, I will move us along to 10.3, which is Discord management policies for SFSS groups. So this is something that I had a massive issue with for years. Ever since like the pandemic in 2020 kind of like forced unions and like clubs and stuff to basically move underground and go to Discord. This has been an ongoing issue. whether it was because people were infiltrating the Discord servers who weren't even SFA students, whether it was the bullying, whether it was all these things that, quite frankly, really show that our policies are inept when it comes to dealing with these issues on an online sphere. I don't think we have anything in line about dealing with Discord and to what authority does the SFSS have over our groups as Discord servers in regards to, can we tell them to not do certain things? Can we tell them to have some level of separation between, for example, past executive roles versus current executive roles? So I don't know what we can do there to make it more clear so there's not like tampering and there's not like anything questionable going on in those servers, because ultimately, arguably, it's a group resource and the SFSS kind of sort of could make an argument that it kind of sort of owns, but it's a uncomfortable territory to march because those groups made those servers, not we. We didn't do anything. So I personally am not a big fan of marching in and demanding groups to do one thing over the other, but at the same time, maybe like some social media policies for groups might be useful, just so we have some level of consistency and decency going on. Ben, you're on the list.
Yeah, the only concern that I potentially have with Discords in this case would be like, I know some groups, including the MSU, do hold their elections over Discord. And my thing would be, we might want to look at certain things about elections to ensure that there aren't any, let's say, shenanigans going on with Discords and elections.
Yeah, like that is an issue, especially because most groups don't verify who their users are. Who's to say that you don't have multiple people in there, but like multiple accounts. So I know at some point in 2020 there was a move towards getting people verified, but that's a process and not all groups have access to that information that would allow them to verify people. We usually do use web survey and stuff to verify. Okay, so yeah, I know there are servers, smaller servers that generally just use like a thumbs up or thumbs down for candidates sometimes, and that's not great because it does kind of like walk the line in terms of our election policies and how that works, especially when it comes to council rep roles. But yeah, go ahead then.
Yeah, that's exactly the concern that I was sort of wanting to raise, is of groups that may use like thumbs up, thumbs down on Discord. The verifiability of that in terms of our elections rules, as you mentioned, especially for council, definitely is something I think we could perhaps look at. I agree with you, though I'm not generally in favor of marching into group Discords and doing things.
I personally don't feel like doing the marching myself either. And I still do not want to send my staff in there to like do it themselves. But I do think some like guidelines might be useful. Be like, hey, if you're holding elections, maybe check for X, Y, and Z. If you're a moderator server, like try to make sure candidates are behaving. I think some basic levels of that might be useful. I also know that some Discord servers are owned by executives who, quite frankly, are no longer executives. And that's an issue, because if we're making the argument that the unions and the unions part of the SFSS, then we have an issue where like a non-member is owning a resource that by virtue is the unions. So having something in line to make sure that transition happens to the next moderator or next president or whatever might be useful to make sure like we don't have people holding Discords hostages. Funny enough, this is not really an issue with like Instagram and Facebook accounts, but it does seem to be an issue with Discord for whatever reason. So maybe something to keep in mind. Anybody have any thoughts? If we exhausted discussion on this, again, I guess move on. So that would be 10.4, which is a council report for the CCBC terms of reference. So folks here know that we received somebody basically decided to task a governance committee of coming up with policy. That's somebody sitting here in this room right now. So in essence, what we need to do is go into CCBC's terms of reference and add in sections that state that CCBC can start an investigation if council tells it to do so. So we don't have CCBC running kind of rampant. Go ahead, Ben, you're on the list.
Yeah, so that's not what governance was really tasked with doing, but my recommendation would be that we don't look at it from the perspective of CCBC not being able to do something. Rather we amend how CCBC starts investigations to basically outline a two-step process where the first step is council or another committee has to recommend to CCBC to start an investigation. The second step is CCBC will receive the recommendation and then accept it or decline it. In essence, accepting it starts the investigation, declining it would, well, do nothing.
Yeah, that's unfortunate. My half brain cells did promise a draft language, so here it is. So what I recommend is, first off, the numbering is absolutely ludicrous. So we're gonna fix that. The other thing is the section that I guess we should add in is 4.5. The committee may, given substantial reason, recommend to council to start an investigation into potential breach of confidence. A summary of assumed reason warranting the recommendation shall be presented to council at a camera session. Council may task CCBC to begin an investigation by simple majority vote. Subsection 1. Directors implicated, if present, must recuse themselves from the discussion and the vote. Subsection 2. If the motion carries, CCBC would go forward with the investigation process outlined from section 4.6 onto 4.18. Yeah. That kind of ensures that council would say as to what CCBC does, so it doesn't look like a secret committee. Ben, you're on the list.
Yeah, I'm gonna recommend we change this language because, well, first of all, council told us through that motion that it's council or another committee that can task CCBC. The wording of that motion was reasonably specific to ensure that it was council or another committee. And further, I would also add that it says that the motion says that CCBC may begin an investigation upon the recommendation of it, not that council can direct CCBC around to do what it wants. My thing is to prevent abuse by council or by another committee. I think it's necessary that CCBC would also have to receive the recommendation and approve it.
I wrote some operation that's just better in terms of if CCBC comes to council. I don't think there's a subsection. I don't think it's implied that council can bestow an investigation onto CCBC. It's if there's substantial reason. CCBC may recommend an investigation to council. Because I also think that there's a leeway where people are more likely to come to a committee than to council directly if there's something wrong. So if there's any tips or reasons to assume a breach happened, it's more like it's going to be dropped on CCBC's doorstep versus councils, to be honest. But Ben, you're on the list.
Yeah, I agree with your wording for 4.5A, and I agree with your reasoning behind it. What I want to reword is basically 4.5B without reword 4.5B and 4.5B2 purely is what I want to reword. The rest of it I think is fine. I think your additions here of the amendments that the like in-camera disclosure stuff and the documentation stuff is all, yeah, I agree that we should do this. And also the other changes that you're suggesting here. Yeah, but after this meeting, I can suggest some stuff to that.
Yeah, for sure. You can definitely change that wording. I quite frankly don't feel comfortable pushing it for anything until we have legal on it, because it's a committee with great power. I'd much rather not be in a position where I do something to it and it turns out to be wrong. So when we get like a finalized language, the first person it would go to is our lawyer, not the council and not to this committee. So okay, cool. We can probably revise that section then. What would you suggest for section B then?
I honestly was just gonna do this after the
Oh,
committee
okay.
meeting.
Okay, cool. That's fine. Sorry, I didn't mean to put you on the spot. Cool. We can just move on to item 10.5, which is communications policy. So I wanted to discuss something because this is the next review we have coming up anyway for the communications policy review. And given that we may have some quite many contrary things in policy, I did want to clarify as to which one we're gonna abide by. Our communications policies, it mainly speaks to our marketing strategies and how advertisement and graphics and stuff like that works for society. It's quite transparent as to how it works. The main point person is our communications coordinator on it and our communications staff. So I guess my biggest concern, if quite frankly any, is in relation how we interact with R5, because we do have a cute little R5 thing in there that says counselors cannot speak on the behalf of society. So my issue is, how do we walk that line, especially when the person's face is pretty recognizable? When it's a popular non-executive counselor, maybe it's an executive counselor, but there are aspects as to how that would go and how we would do this without taking labor away from staff, avoiding grievances, maybe in relation to communication policy number 8, for example, survey development and distribution. Counselors can make their own surveys if they want to. Execs can make their own surveys if they want to. To the best of my understanding, we're allowed to, but it doesn't quite make sense with the policy we have in line, and then how that will work with R5, because if you have your bias in there, or like you are having a certain slant, it could be interpreted as a not so ethical thing to do. So I guess I'm going to put it out to the committee. What do we do with it? Go ahead, Ben.
So as someone that has sent my fair share of surveys and emails and Reddit posts last council term, I personally think we should be very, very restrictive in some sense. I personally have always tried to lean as close to just being purely objective and based on what happened. I think there is a line that should be drawn just for the clarity of all of council, so that councilors know, executives and non-executives know what they can and can't do without getting in trouble. And further, I think that I think we should, in my mind, people should at least be able to say something to some extent, but not like directly advocating against the stated position of the society. That would seem not allowed or not advisable, certainly.
Yeah, I agree. And I think my biggest issue is that this is something that kind of happened last year in terms of especially the last executive, in terms of decisions made. I remember this specifically when they took office and some of the referenda failed. So yeah, my concern is that it is a different council composition and there are different standards as to what people need to abide to. Without it being very clear, I would have a very conservative interpretation as to what you can and cannot say. My biggest concern is like getting people into unnecessary trouble for no reason, and then we have to start censuring people. Go ahead, Ben.
Yeah, and last term was last term well, and I would agree with taking an extremely conservative interpretation at this point until there is a finer and better line drawn, because especially I can see the issue arising more with executive officers is that they're less distinguishable from the position of the society than a non-executive in many ways, especially those who have signing authority.
Yeah, that's probably the issue, really, because I was an alternate, I was doing a lot of things, and I had no issue very blatantly stating my opinion on council's business. Which I disagree with it, and now it's been like almost 3 months where things happen, and once it passes council, I basically don't ever speak with it again, because there is language in R5 that we need to uphold council's decision even if you disagree with it. So it is kind of restrictive as to like how much a person can say. Because it's unclear, but you can state your opinion, but like, I don't like this, but council approved this, so there's nothing I can do about it. Versus, like, can you just say council approved it, no further comment? Because that's an issue. That's an issue with authenticity and how well we communicate with our membership. Because they did vote in individuals and not basically a collective of people. So there is kind of an expectation that you're going to speak frankly with your membership if you don't like something. But how can you do that without being censured or impeached? That's the biggest thing. Especially for non-executive counselors, it's easier to impeach them versus executive officers. So we are running that risk. So what do we do? I don't see anybody offering any recourse or action. So yeah, go ahead, Abby.
Well, it's a big question to ask. What do we do? Because it's a big question. But I guess I can see the reasoning behind an executive or a counselor potentially wanting to go on their own and say stuff, just because sometimes when you're saying something on their society, guys, you can't be as transparent or as open and honest as you want to be. Whereas if you're saying something to yourself, you're also a little more likely to be more receptive to an audience who wouldn't listen to like a general email blast. But again, obviously, like you said, there's a huge liability of saying the wrong thing and getting censured or impeached. And that risk is really, really high. So I don't have an answer, but we should certainly weigh the options and see, hopefully land somewhere in between giving people some sort of autonomy, but having the appropriate checks and balances in place to prevent breaches of confidence or people just getting censured left, right, and center.
So my suggestion to this, and I'm not sure if it's been done before, I think it's better to have some guidelines for council to what we can say or not. I don't think you do policy or any of that because we do have policy. We just need the policy to make sense in practice. I think that's what we need, because if you have it in writing, and you don't have to use it, it's whatever. I know I thought it was whatever because before I took office, I didn't really have an issue with it. When I took office, I had plenty of issues with it. So, and I'm not the only one, unfortunately. So I think just guidelines are like literally outlining, hey, you can say this, but you can't say that. You can say, in my opinion, I didn't like this policy, but it passed, but you can't say, this policy sucks. The person going forward sucks. Can't believe this passed. Down with council. Like you should not be able to say that, which you would think I made up, but last council year showed that some people use some very creative language to describe council's actions. So just outlining that will also ensure that people are not getting censured and impeached or fined, or basically if you're an exec officer, oversight on your tail 24/7. So that might be useful. I think we talk to our communications department first to make sure that they're knowing what we're doing and they sign off as to whatever we allow them to say. Because ultimately, if a counselor says something stupid, and if the membership notices it, it's really the comm department's job to get a statement, basically put together with exec and send it out. So they should probably be aware as to what we're allowing people to say, which sounds horrible, but there is a legal liability as to what we say, especially an exec officer. Whatever we say, it's hard to detach ourselves from our roles. Ben, is it a current list or a past list?
Current list.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, so based on what suggestions you've just offered, and sort of as we're discussing OTP2 and OTP3 today, I wonder if we could incorporate such guidelines into like a counselor resource manual just to give to new counselors, because it seems like at that point that would be kind of the time when you'd want to, well, learn about that, learn about what you can and can't say.
Yeah, I agree. And I think we are walking a tight line because it is a charter right, freedom of expression. So like this is not ideal, but this is a corporation. You can't just go around being a director of a corporation and saying ludicrous things or things that harm society. We had plenty of examples of that last year. So yeah. So we should probably make it clear. I think one key component of the decision of council has to be respected, even if you don't agree with it. Majority rules and whatever, or 2/3 rules, or whatever threshold you want to apply, depending on what passed. So that might be helpful, and I think it might be a good medium for those who feel like this policy is stifling them, or allow some basic interaction with membership, because it is right now a very like counselors here, membership here kind of situation, which is not how it should be. So any thoughts, comments? Since we're reviewing communications policy next, I think that might be something worthwhile, like looking at like what we can pull from it and what guidelines we can in place and how those guidelines will interact with policy. But we can circle back to this. Okay. All right. If there is no further discourse on this, we can move on to our next item on the agenda, which is our last item on the agenda. It's adjournment. So the motion would be resolved to adjourn this meeting at 4:49 p.m. I will move. Can I get a second?
Math.
Matt seconds. I will open the floor for discussion. Seeing none, I'll seek unanimous consent. If you wish to dissent, raise your hand or indicate in the chat. Seeing no dissent, this carries unanimously and we have adjourned. Thank you for joining everyone and basically good night.